So we're working through chapter 22. We just finished listening to the Bartók piece. So now let's turn and look at what's happening in American music, and in particular American modern music. So after 1920, so this is anticipated by Ives, who we took a look at in our lecture last class period. Musical climate is more favorable to new ideas after World War I. The war brought greater attention to things in Europe and what was going on in Europe. There were American writers living abroad, such as Hemingway and Stein and Eliot. The Americans were getting their ideas from Europe. They were hearing more ideas from Europe. They were traveling. In the 1920s and the 1930s, you have radio broadcasts that start to become more common in everyone's homes. The works of Stravinsky and Schoenberg see their first American performances after 1920 here in America. And jazz and blues and other popular idioms are really starting to take off. So there's a lot of musical societies that are formed to encourage the composition and performance of new music. The International Composers Guild was founded in 1921. They perform only unheard works at their concerts, only new works. And the next three American composers that we're going to take a look at all benefit from this. They all come through that channel of the International Composers Guild. The first one that we're going to take a look at is Ruth Crawford. So Ruth Crawford lived 1901 to 1953. She was born in Ohio, the daughter of a minister, and she's the first woman to win a Guggenheim Fellowship in composition in 1931. She used it to go to Europe, where she studied with Bartók, who we just talked about, as well as Alvin Berg. So you can expect to hear some nationalistic. You can expect to hear Berg, remember, was Expressionism with his style. She liked to collect and transcribe and arrange and publish folk music, American folk music, so very much in the style of Bartók. She was a musicologist, so she's someone that studied the history of music throughout her life. And she was married to composer Charles Seeger. So if the name Seeger sounds familiar, her stepson is Pete Seeger, so folk musician Pete Seeger. So in early America, I would say she is a composer that we could call avant-garde. She's an avant-garde modernist. She's trying to push the envelope a little bit of the parameters of what is considered music, the parameters of tonality. She's a woman in a male-dominated field. She devoted less than half of her life to composition. She was really taking off and I think becoming very popular as a composer. She got married and then turned to raising her family and the study of musicology. When you listen to this piano piece, you're going to hear a lot of dissonance. It's very atonal, so atonal meaning that there's no home pitch or no center pitch. There's very clear counterpoint, so counterpoint meaning that you're going to hear imitation or lines coming in. The textures are very layered. She was a very skilled pianist. This is a very short piece. You have a description and a very short guide to help you through it on page 345. With it being such a short piece, it's very much in the style of a romantic miniature. So it's called a prelude, a term that we saw with Chopin, Scriabin, Debussy, lots of pianists wrote preludes. It has three layers to it. I think you'll hear there's very distinct three levels of pitch. There's a high ostinato in the top two parts. So remember, ostinato means any repeating figure that seems to be the foundation or basis of a piece. So we hear that high ostinato, then there's a second and third layer that appear. There's some rolling chords in that low voice, and there's a lot of chromaticism in the middle, but I think it's easy to hear that it definitely is a three-line textures. So what I want you to focus on is hearing the texture. See if you can hear the three lines. Think about what it means that it's atonal, that there's little sense of a tonic center. So if you stopped it and I said, you know, hum the pitch that your ear is going to. We've done that in class many times. It's probably not going to be easy to find, if you can find it at all. And the harmonies are very dissonant. So using the extremely high register of the piano, that's typical of avant-garde music, pushing those boundaries. Typical of a prelude, it's a very free form. It's not going to fall into a rondo sonata form, theme and variations. It's almost improvisatory. So in thinking about that 3-line texture, you've got the right hand as one line, the left hand low bass is a second line, and when they connect in the middle or helping out, there's your third line with texture. I think it's definitely a piece that you need to listen to several times. A, to comprehend what's going on, but B, to hope that it grows on you a little bit. The next American that your book covers is William Grant Still. He lived 1895 to 1978. He is an African-American composer and performer. Both men and women have become pretty prominent composers in the 20th century. It's becoming difficult for African-Americans to break through that. Even women are even accepted, it seems like, before they are. For many years, music schools admitted African-American students, but barred them as performers or conductors in established symphonic or opera houses. The color barrier really isn't broken until the New York City Opera hires some African-American musicians in 1945. The Metropolitan Opera finally does in 1955. Black conductors tend to find jobs in Europe in the 1950s and 1960s. It isn't until the 1970s that you see American posts as conducting at major symphonies. New Jersey Symphony is one of the first to do it in the early 1970s with an African-American conductor. Really kind of appalling dates when you think about it. William Grant Still was born in Mississippi to a middle-class family. His parents were school teachers. His dad was a band leader on the side. He studied music. He received 2 Guggenheim Fellowships. In 1919, he settled in New York City, and he did a lot of arranging for blues groups. In 1934, he moved to Los Angeles, where he continued his composing career, did a lot of arranging for films. Huge output of music, everything from solo songs with piano to orchestra, ballet, opera. He strove to really capture the distinctive African-American sound or the African-American identity. And the way that he does this is by incorporating blues and jazz into his music. The subjects, when he's working on vocal music and operas, tend to be stories based in African-American traditions. There's also quite a bit of nationalism from the minority position of this minority in America. This is their nationalistic songs and stories. So I think that his music definitely can be called nationalistic. The piece that you have in your book, there's a nice overview of it on 348. You've got a guide on page 349. The symphony, this is his Afro-American Symphony. It's the first symphony by a black composer that was performed by a major symphony. It was premiered by the Rochester Philharmonic in 1930. It's fairly conventional to what we expect from that romantic form of 4 movements. The tempos and forms are very predictable from what we would expect. First movement sonata allegro form, second movement slower, a little bit more melodic in a freer form. Third movement is a dance. You've got a clear sense of tonic. The melody, the harmony, and the rhythm have a great flavor of blues and jazz. There's a lot of syncopation. He uses a jazz scale which has a minor third in it. It has a very distinct sound to it. Your book is giving you the 4th movement, and that's what I have on canvas for you. This 4th movement is what you would expect. Fast, in the tonic key, and is following that rondo form. So remember, your rondo form is going to be A, B, A, C, A, and I think it's fairly easy to hear as it goes through these forms. Your book does not recognize the C form quite quite as much as I do feel like there's a hint of a C form in there. But even with an ABABA, rather than calling it a ternary design, I think I would still call it a rondo design. I think you're going to clearly hear the mixing of European and African American styles in this. It's closely related to that rondo form, but a little bit slower tempo than what you might expect. Listen to how the A theme and the B theme definitely have a blues flavor to this. He titled this Aspiration based on a poem of Lawrence Dunbar. So by tying it that way, not only can we call it nationalistic, we also could call it programmatic as well. So as you can see by your guide, this is a lengthy movement, close to 8 minutes. I think the melodies are just gorgeous. You very easily can imagine the words, or that there are words to it, with these being African American folk tunes or spirituals. So a beautiful piece in the African American tradition that becomes a staple in American symphonic literature. So I hope you enjoy working through that piece. The last American that we're going to look at today or talk about today is Aaron Copland, 1900 to 1990. I think that most people would agree that if you had to pick the leading American composer of the 20th century, whose music is probably the most well-known, whose music is tied with that nationalistic tendency to our country, most people are going to pick Aaron Copland. His style passes through several phases. He grows up in a Russian Jewish immigrant family in New York. He starts out very much as an avant-garde modernist composer, uses a lot of ideas that Stravinsky had, but as he grows in his composing, he turns more traditional. He tends to hold back from the extremes. He forged his own style, and he definitely adopted a nationalistic agenda. Most of his music speaks to fellow Americans about scenery, about events in American life, about travel, about personal relationships. He wasn't exposed to a lot of music growing up. In 1921, he went to study in Paris. And then he returned to New York, and his goal was to write music that was American in character. That's what he went, that's what he said. And to him, American meant jazz. There is some dissonance in his works. He did write some works that are highly dissonant, but I would say that most of his works are very accessible. One of the reasons that I think that his music maybe started out avant-garde or pushing the dissonance, pushing the envelope of what was accepted, and then actually takes a step back, can be attributed to the Depression years. So during the Depression years in the 1930s, there was less conversation, less travel, less international affairs, I guess, going on with Europe. The experimentation declined as the U.S. kind of retreated to pick its own self up from its bootstraps with this depression and get back on its feet financially. And during those Depression years, people really tended to draw on folklore. And so that worked in Copland's benefit, and he thought that folklore gave a broad appeal and reflected really the mood of the time. So he did not like the idea of composing for the elite. He wanted to compose for middle America. He wanted to compose for the people of America. So jazz is incorporated, revival hymns that would be sung, if you think of On the Prairie and the Old West, cowboy songs, folk music. Those are all things that he puts in his work. His work has been used in a lot of films. A lot of his work has patriotic ties to it. Very clean textures, slow-moving harmonies, and very strongly tonal. You definitely can hear where that tonal pitch is. He very often liked to try to paint the American landscape through his music. He does use a lot of changing meter. So we saw that, we were talking about that with Bartok. So we were calling it polymeter or polyrhythm, but you could also call it polymeter, or meaning that there's more than one meter going on at a time. A lot of percussion, a lot of very innovative orchestration. He did write one work where he tried writing it with the tone roll with that serialism, but that really isn't what he's well known for. The piece that you have in Canvas, Appalachian Spring, very famous piece written in 1944, and I'm guessing you are going to recognize parts of this. It's been used in everything from commercials to movies, to being played on all sorts of radio stations. It was commissioned by Martha Graham. She was an American choreographer of contemporary dance, and she commissioned it as a ballet. Later, Copland made it into a symphony, or put it into a symphonic piece, and that's more often how it is performed today. It's based on a rural Pennsylvania setting, on an American newlywed couple that's celebrating spring in the 1800s, or spring in that pioneer time. It took about a year for him to write. It has characters in it, so it's very programmatic, even though there's not a word in it. There's a bride and a groom and neighbors and a preacher. The melodies and the rhythms are very American sounding. I think you're going to hear what sounds like a barn dance. You're going to hear fiddle tunes. You're going to hear revival hymns. One of the hymns in it, or one of the folk tunes in it, is actually that shaker melody. It's a gift to be simple, it's a gift to be free. Very famous melody that's been used a lot. There are 8 sections to the piece, and the 8 sections take you through a day in the life here of this newlywed couple. And I think your book on 350 and 351 does a nice job of guiding you through the story. It was originally for 13 instruments, so a smaller group. It was later scored for a bigger group. We have the smaller group on our canvas here. I've performed this a couple different times with different symphonic groups in the area. Once as a small group and once as a large group. It works well with either. It's what he called a concert suite because it has 6 sections that tell like the 6 chapters of the story as it goes through. The first section is you can hear daybreak, and the second section is a square dance celebrating the new house of the newlyweds. Third section you hear this square dance, and it moves into the 4th section, which is the preacher or the sermon. The 5th section then being that simple gifts. And then it ends quietly, almost like a prayer or a hymn as you're looking out at the landscape of your farm. I'm going to start this for you. So this quiet beginning is supposed to be, sitting on the porch, the sun rising, the animals coming to life, the first break of dawn. You can see by the yellow dots when you're going through this where the division of the sections is. So here you hear that syncopation as it's taking you into the second section. There's one of those famous melodies. I think it was used by the meat organization or something a while ago in a commercial. There's that idea of that break of dawn coming back. So beautiful piece. You do have the whole of it on canvas, so a little bit longer than what your book is talking through, but I think you'll enjoy it. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous piece. So The other thing that's happening here as we're working in between the world wars and getting towards 1930s, 1940s, I just want to mention, and it's brought up at the end of the chapter here of 22, is the rise of film music. So film or cinema, whatever you want to call it, has a huge impact on all of the arts in the 20th century. It's a new arena for musical composition. It's almost like when public concerts started in the 18th century and brought a new place for music to be performed. That's what the film industry is going to do for music at this point. It's reaching a bigger audience. Film embraces a wide variety of music. I'm sure if you think back just to some of the favorite music you've heard in films, there's avant-garde modernism, there's jazz, there's pop, there's rock, there's rap, there's minimalism. Every kind of music that you can imagine has been used in films. At this point in the early 20th century, romantic symphonies seem to be the most prevalent of what you're hearing. There's a big connection here with opera and program music when you're talking about film music. Silent film, when films first started to be developed, were using live musicians. You have pianists or organists, and usually they would improvise what was on the screen. So they were trying to come up with chords that sounded like the person was scared or nervous or happy or falling in love. So very much programmatic. Often they would use themes of romantic symphonies that they had heard, and they would bring those themes back, almost a leitmotif technique. As we got into films that had sound, as we were getting into the late 1920s or the film strip, you started to hear more continuous scores. Leitmotif still is popular. Think to your favorite Lord of the Rings film or a Harry Potter film. Or if you can't think about it, watch one of those favorite films now that we're all staying safe at home and perhaps you have some more time. And see if you can figure out, does Harry have a certain motive that comes back? Does his interactions with certain characters have certain motives that come back? I think you'll find that they do. And so that's very much drawing from what we saw Wagner developing with his opera. It's hearkening all the way back to what we saw Beethoven doing with his Fifth Symphony. We see that the film scores start to be synchronized to the action. King Kong in 1933 was one of the first films to do this. Composers that are famous for film scores often aren't found in our textbooks, but they are fabulous composers that really hearken to be noted. Max Steiner, Gone with the Wind, King Kong, wonderful scores. John Williams, the Star Wars, that's a drop in the bucket compared to what he's written. Wonderful composer there. Herman with the Psycho score. Still, that we've listened to already, William Grant Still wrote film scores. Copland wrote film scores. Leonard Bernstein writes a lot of film scores. We're going to take a look at his musical West Side Story here in chapter 24. So America isn't the only place that this is happening with film music, and I think it's interesting that we sometimes think we're on the forefront there, but I think it's interesting that your text chose to give you an example of a film score coming out of Russia. So on page 355, there is a score of Alexander Nevsky, which is by Sergei Prokofiev. So Stalin and Lenin in the USSR see that there's power in the film mass market here, that is a way that they can promote their socialist propaganda, and it's a way for them to get their message across to the masses. And so they want their Russian composers to write film scores. Prokofiev wrote quite a few of them. Shostakovich is another Russian that wrote quite a few of them. So Prokofiev lived from 1891 to 1953. He was a child prodigy, a concert pianist, also worked as a conductor, as a composer. He was born in the Ukraine, went to school in St. Petersburg. His early work's quite radical. He paralleled Stravinsky, or modeled it after Stravinsky, but he tended to move away from that, more towards a clearer tonality. He liked to use Russian folk tunes. He did come and work in the West for a while, but returned to Russia in 1936. Stalin wanted patriotic music that was going to promote Russia, that was going to promote socialist realism. He wanted the music associated with common works and to serve the state. everything Prokofiev wrote or anything a Russian composer wrote had to be approved by Stalin or Lenin. And by 1948, a lot of their music was denounced or banned. But this example we have is from 1938. It is Alexander Nevsky, and originally was a film. Later he refashioned it into a cantata so it could be performed as a concert or heard more. It was a propaganda piece in the fact that it's a Russian folktale that was, the story was a 13th century Russian hero who writes about the Russian forces being strong and invading Germany and being successful. So just the type of propaganda that Stalin and Lenin wanted going out to their people. And so the clip that we have on Canvas, and it is on your score sheet to follow along on in 355, is the beginning of the final climactic scene where the Russians and the Germans meet in a battle on the frozen ice. It's a vivid sound picture of action. So I want you to think about what elements are you hearing that sound like action or war? What sounds like frozen water or frozen lake? It's in minor, which I think minor sounds cold. There's a drum roll. Is that militaristic to you? Or is that the shivering maybe that you hear from the cold? The trombones have a battle call. It's muted. So maybe that's sounding far away. The singing is the Germans in a liturgical hymn. Lots of noise that I think sounds like the battle. So this clip that I've chosen is giving you scenes that are depicting what the original movie score was showing. So I would suggest listening to it once, see what you're picturing in your mind, go back and listen to it again, follow the outline on 355, which tells you what your textbook thinks you're hearing at certain points as far as the battle or what the staccato notes are indicating. But it's a very interesting piece, and I think it's interesting to think about that film industry not being just confined to America here in the 1920s. So what's going to happen as we come out of World War II here? European composers are affected by economic and political and military upheavals. Institutions, orchestras, opera houses, they've disappeared, they've had to shut down. There's staggering inflation, there's worldwide depressions setting in different countries. I think avant-garde music really faces a lot of threats. It's banned a lot of places. Our countries want music that's going to unite the people as we struggle to move forward, as we struggle to come out of the disaster of World War II, as we struggle to get our economies back to work. National folk music very much, I think, is a vehicle to help build people up and build those countries back up, because it's not individualistic and it's more of a cultural bringing it all together. There isn't the elitism in it that we're seeing with what was coming out of Stalin or Hitler or the Nazi regime. In Nazi Germany, you had a point where they were only promoting German masters such as Beethoven and Wagner. They were banning modern music. They were banning any Jewish composers such as Schoenberg and Copland. In the Soviet Union, as we just saw with Shostakovich, Prokofiev, they're having to follow the dictates of the government as to what they can write and what they can't write. They weren't allowed to have strong dissonance. The subject and the music needed to be approved. It couldn't be anything shocking. And so a lot of composers do start to write secret music with plots that are not what the government wanted, have secret musical figures. They're making musical jokes at their country's expense, using chords that have been forbidden, using harmonies that are forbidden. So we're in a very different place coming out of that Second World War than we were coming into it. So it is an interesting place to be. It could be a whole class on its own, seeing how this affects the musical world, but I hope this has given you just a little bit of an idea of the growth, the control, and how music is affecting our world here in that snippet of time that was so important between World War I and World War II.